Welcome to another class here for YPS, Yeshiva Pirkei Shoshanim, and Nativ Center Online for Noahide Studies and Education. In this class, we're going to be talking about the concept of Ever Min HaChai. It is an important concept for us to begin to understand. It's sort of an idea to start out the study of dietary laws that apply to Noahides. The most important prohibition in this arena is this concept of Min HaChai, that of a limb taken from a living animal. It seems to be a fairly obscure text when you read it, but in reality, we hope to be able to deal with it fully so you can understand what this means. What may mean at first, it seems to be a sort of a narrow prohibition. It involves several very important details. The question should be asked, when was the concept of Ever Min HaChai given? As we should recall from a very early lesson, the Talmud derives all 7 laws from Genesis 2:16, which states, "And the Lord God commanded the man, saying, of every tree of the garden you may surely eat." Ever Min HaChai, besides being derived from this verse, was also commanded directly to Noah after the flood. There are 2 opinions as to the reason for this repetition. Both of these interpretations are tied to another Talmudic debate as to whether or not Adam was permitted to eat meat. Rashi and Tosafos both hold that, as the Talmud states, all 7 laws were given to Adam at the time of creation. This would include even this concept of Min HaChai. Of course, Ever Min HaChai could only be relevant if Adam was permitted to eat meat at this time. According to Rashi and Tosafos, Adam was permitted to eat meat. However, he was not allowed to kill animals for food. Adam was only allowed to eat animals that had died on their own. It was not until after the flood that man received permission from the Holy One to kill animals for food. Maimonides understands the Talmud's derivation of the Noahide laws from Genesis, a supporting allusion to the existence of the laws prior to the time of Noah. It is not a hard and fast source for their derivation based on a much simpler reading of the Torah text. Maimonides proposes that a man was not given permission to eat meat until after the flood. Therefore, Adam could not have been given the command regarding to the concept of Ever Min HaChai. It was only after the flood, when man was permitted to eat meat, that God gave the commandment against this concept of Ever Min HaChai. Tosafos and Rashi and Maimonides, however, agree to the following points. At creation, Adam was given the right to use animals for any useful task, as the Torah teaches. And God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the fowl of the air and over every living thing that creeps upon the earth." This permission, however, did not extend to killing animals for food. Now, considering these 2 points of the utility of animals for human needs versus the prohibition of killing them for food, the question naturally arises: was Adam allowed to cause pain or suffering to animals? It is said by the Zohar Ba'ali Chaim, animal cruelty is the prohibition against cruelty, is a statement that is essential for the Noahide. It applies to Noahides. This exact detail of the prohibition will be examined in greater detail in a future lesson. For the purpose of this lesson, though, we at least need to know that it applies to and will be relevant to our study of the laws of Ever Min HaChai. The commandment to Noah states this, that in times of Noah, all agreed that man was given permission to now kill animals for the sake of food. "The fear of you and the dread upon you shall be every beast of the earth and every bird of the sky and upon everything that moves upon the earth and upon all the fish of the sea, and to your hand they are given. Every moving thing that has life shall be yours for food. I have given them unto you like the green herbage." Now, the commandment of Ever Min HaChai was either given here for the first time or reaffirmed in light of the permission to kill animals for food. This idea of able to subdue animals, the creatures would be in fear of man because of this, is an interesting idea. But flesh with its soul, its blood, you shall not eat. The Talmud, in Tractate Sanhedrin 59a, explains that this verse is the prohibition of Ever Min Hachai. Ever Min Hachai versus the verses itself. The term Ever Min Hachai is a Talmudic paraphrase of the source verse for the prohibition. It is much more convenient and indeed specific way of referring to the law. However, it contains a subtle weakness. Ever Min Hachai is often translated as a limb torn from a living animal. This is a terrible translation. This verse in the Torah states very simple, but flesh with its soul, its blood, you shall not eat. The Talmud rephrases this prohibition as Ever Min Hachai, which literally means a limb or part of a limbed animal. Now let's break this down for just a moment for you to understand. The term ever, it means a limb or a part. The verse states flesh, which is a broad term, and we have to whittle down a bit. Although the Hebrew word for flesh is sometimes used specifically for meat, in this context it means almost any part, edible part, taken from an animal. Now the Talmud rephrases it with the term ever to capture the broader meaning of the word flesh. The extent of the prohibition is to prohibit anything separated from an animal while it lives. Very important fact. Let's look at the term and the word men. From. This means from. The verse does not say anything about material being taken from it or torn from it, a living animal. Therefore, the method by which the material is separated from the animal is irrelevant. A limb remains prohibited even if it falls from the animal on its own. This should note that according to this point and the previous one, even milk and eggs should be prohibited. Now, don't draw any conclusions yet. We're not through. We'll discuss milk and eggs in the next lesson. Let's look at the word hachai. The living is what it means. This last term is very broad. In fact, it is too broad because the actual verse contains a qualification that limits, quote, the living to which it applies. But flesh with its soul, its blood, you shall not eat. Note that this verse draws a distinction between the flesh and the blood of an animal. This distinction actually has an important place in Torah law. For example, for Jews, consuming blood violates an injunction against consuming any kind of blood, the punishment for which is karas, or spiritual excision, to separate them from the tribe. Eating the meat of a horse, for example, however, is prohibited to the Jews for a separate reason. The idea of eating blood of a horse, that's one bad thing, but you're not even supposed to eat a horse. Jews, for the separation reason, the prohibition against eating the meat of a non-kosher species, the punishment for which is lashes. Our verse states the qualification, flesh with its soul, which is its blood, to teach us that the prohibition of Ever Min Hachai only applies to animals for which the Torah makes a legal distinction between their flesh and their blood. There are many animals for which the Torah makes no distinction between the flesh and their blood. For these animals, the entire animal and all the parts and pieces are included under one prohibition against eating. Since the Torah makes no distinctions for these animals, then the concept Ever Min Hachai does not apply to these animals. To which animals does it apply, is the question we should be asking. Ever Min Hachai does not apply to a class of 8 animals mentioned in the Torah law from Leviticus 11:29 through 30. This is because there is no distinction between the blood and the flesh in Torah law. All the commentaries agree that the common mouse, for example, and most likely the monitor lizard are among these 8 creatures. However, there is disagreement as to the identity of the remaining 6. Now, the following are what we call the sharatzim, which with the various opinions as to their identity. The koholed. The Talmud describes this as a predatory, burrowing animal that tunnels underneath a house. Here are some examples. A rat in Targum Onkelos and Tosafot Yom Tov, a field mouse, is listed in Targum Yonasan. Akbar most agreed that this is the sort of the common house mouse. Some include the rat under this term as well. Tzav, the Talmud replies that it is similar to a salamander or a snake. Then there is a toad. This is the opinion of Rashi in Leviticus 11:29 and 5:56a. And indeed, many of the Rishonim seem to compare it to a frog. Then we have the hedgehog or beaver by the Radak. Then there is the lizard. According to the Radak, from the description of the various commentaries, it is most likely the monitor lizard. Another species of lizard or great gecko. How about Rashi says a snail is another one of those. Many of the commentaries identify this also as a skunk. The Tin Shemes list the mole, or Rashi, to Chulin, as 63a, a burrowing lizard of some sort. And further exemption from the prohibition of Ever Min Chai are all sea creatures, and snakes, frogs, lizards, etc. It is therefore permitted to consume limbs from dolphins, crabs, lobsters, etc. Now, before the animal has actually expired, that is, it would be permitted for a non-Jew to eat those things before the animals expired. However, it is preferably done in a manner to minimize suffering in the animals. I repeat, some of these animals may not be permissible for a Jew to eat, but the non-Jew does not have those prohibitions. However, there are certain animals by which you cannot tear a limb out of, and here we have experts in the Rishonim that would say that possibly dolphins, crabs, lobsters could have their limbs ripped apart, which I don't know of a single Noahide that would actually do something that horrible. Now, there is this concept of a prohibition against animal cruelty. There are some further important clarifications to make. Rodents, for example, because of the uncertainty in identifying all of these specific species and all the doubt on a biblically prohibited manner, one must treat all rodents as if ever min chai applies to them. And the exception, however, is the common mouse. It is certain that the mouse is a sheretz, and that ever min chai does not apply to it. How about seals, otters, and walruses, etc.? The mammals all live in the water as well as on the land, and they're to be treated as sea creatures and exempted from the concept of ever min chai, or as land mammals and included in ever min chai. Maimonides classifies sea lions as sea creatures, which implies that they are exempt from this idea of limb from a living animal. Chulin 127a, if a mammal can travel on land of its own power, then it is considered a land animal in halakha. The Mishnah in Kelim 17:13, the carcass of a sea lion is subject to certain types of ritual impurity that do not apply to sea animals. Therefore, the sea lion must be a land animal. Tafnas states on Maimonides, based on many of the cited rebuttals, rejects Maimonides as the law of this practice. In practice, seals, otters, and walruses and similar creatures are considered land animals and subject to this concept of a limb from a living animal. Now, what is called basar, flesh? The source verse prohibits basar, or flesh, from a living animal. This means that one is only liable for punishment for having eaten basar from a living animal. However, this is a broad term as well, which applies to various ways. Additionally, any prohibition against eating something only applies if that item is considered fit for consumption. That's the first concept. The criteria for determination are complex and require really an expert posek, or expert teacher of the law. The following is a basic guide. Again, note that we're not dealing with what is called basar for the sake of liability. Eating anything from a living animal is prohibited. Bottom line, even if it does not incur punishment for doing. Let's look at the concept that comes behind the idea of what to do with the bones, because bones are not considered fit for human consumption. They are not called basar. One should not eat them. However, bone marrow is considered basar, flesh. How about tendons and sinew? Although not considered basar, their consumption is prohibited, not allowed. However, one is not liable to punishment for eating them. Let's look at horns, hooves, and feathers. These parts, or even their soft inner parts, are called basar, or flesh. And therefore, ever min hachai does not apply. Again, however, they should not be consumed. Flesh of the bird. Although the prohibition applies to birds, just as it does to land mammals, one is not liable to punishment for consuming flesh of a bird. How about the skin and hides? Hides and skins are sometimes called bashar and sometimes not called bashar. Any question of ever min hachai that may arise regarding hides or skin should be presented to an expert in Torah law who can explain these things. Let's look at Noahide laws. First, a placenta expelled naturally by an animal may be eaten and is not included at all in the prohibition of ever min hachai. However, if it is removed from the animal before it gives birth, then it is prohibited as a limb of a living animal. Blood is not included in the prohibition of ever min hachai. As we mentioned above, the Hebrew word bashar is flesh, a broad and includes almost all parts of an animal, including the blood. However, the source verse making this distinction between blood and flesh states this: but flesh with its soul, its blood, you shall not eat. Maimonides and Kesef Mishnah, based on Sanhedrin, explain that this prohibits bashar taking from an animal while it is living, but not the blood taking from the animal while it is living. Blood may be consumed by Noahides even if it is taken from an animal while it is living. This concept itself should answer a few of the questions that many Noahides ask, that if we are not to eat the limb of a living animal, would that not be eating blood, and that we should not be eating blood? Well, it is very clear that this is talking about animal cruelty. It's talking about ripping a limb off an animal that's alive and consuming its flesh. The blood in the flesh is not prohibited. Therefore, Noahides are not obligated to eat what we call hechshered kosher meat that is served in Jewish markets. Do many Noahides do that? Yes, they do, and they're very careful with it. But I would say that there are plenty of Noahides that are looking for direction in this, and it is clear eating a steak that has not been shecht or butchered with kosher methods is still not prohibited. You can clearly have that kind of meat and not be in any violation of Torah law. That concludes this class, and we'll see you in the next one. Shalom.